The waiter had barely poured the wine when my husband smiled at his business partner and switched to Spanish. He thought I didn't understand a single word. Neither of them knew I had spent 4 years living in Madrid before we met. I kept smiling while my heart slowly stopped. Then I heard the sentence that changed everything. Tonight, she's yours. By tomorrow, she'll sign whatever we need. They laughed, clinked their glasses, and looked at me like I was completely unaware. I didn't react. I simply lifted my wine and started planning exactly how I would destroy their entire deal. My name is Sophia Bennett. I'm 31 years old, and until 6 months ago, I honestly believed I had built the kind of marriage people secretly wished they had. I owned a successful interior design studio in Chicago. My husband, Ethan, was a fast-rising real estate developer whose projects were constantly featured in business magazines. Together, we looked like the perfect couple. We hosted dinner parties, traveled whenever our schedules allowed, and smiled through every anniversary photo like we had absolutely nothing to hide. The truth was far less polished. It wasn't one dramatic fight that changed us. It was dozens of tiny moments that quietly piled on top of each other. Ethan started taking business calls outside. His phone suddenly never left his hand. Whenever I asked about his newest international project, he always smiled, kissed my forehead, and said, "It's complicated. I'll explain everything once the contracts are finalized." I wanted to believe him. Love has a strange way of making ordinary excuses sound perfectly reasonable. Then, one Friday evening, Ethan came home carrying an expensive bottle of wine and wearing the confident smile he usually saved for closing major deals. "I need you to come to dinner tomorrow," he said. "You're finally meeting my business partner." He explained that the investor was flying in from Spain and that this partnership could change both of our lives forever. I congratulated him immediately. After all, I thought successful marriages celebrated each other's victories. What Ethan didn't know was that Spain wasn't just another country to me. When I was 20, I had accepted a university exchange program in Madrid. What was supposed to be one semester became nearly 4 unforgettable years. By the time I returned to the United States, I spoke Spanish almost as naturally as English. I rarely mentioned it because almost nobody ever asked. Oddly enough, Ethan never had. Over the years, he simply assumed I knew a few tourist phrases, and I never found a reason to correct him. Looking back now, that tiny misunderstanding would become the single most important secret I had ever kept. Because the dinner he was so excited about was the night my entire life changed forever. The restaurant Ethan chose overlooked the Chicago River, the kind of place where reservations took months and every table seemed reserved for people discussing fortunes instead of dinner. As soon as we arrived, a tall, sharply dressed man stepped forward with a warm smile. "Sophia, this is Alejandro Morales," Ethan said. "My business partner." Alejandro shook my hand politely, complimented my dress, and welcomed us inside. On the surface, everything felt perfectly normal. We ordered wine, exchanged stories, and laughed through casual conversation while servers quietly moved around us. For the first 20 minutes, nothing seemed unusual. Then the waiter left after pouring our wine, and Ethan casually switched into Spanish. Alejandro answered without hesitation. I lowered my eyes to the menu and forced myself not to react. They believed I couldn't understand a single word. At first, they discussed construction permits, overseas investors, and property acquisitions. Everything sounded like ordinary business. Then Alejandro leaned back and smiled. "Estás completamente seguro?" he asked. "Why tu esposa? Are you completely sure? What about your wife?" Ethan didn't even glance at me before answering. "Esta noche es tuya. Mañana firmará todo lo que necesitamos. Tonight she's yours. Tomorrow she'll sign everything we need." For a second, I couldn't breathe. Alejandro laughed quietly. "Why esa hace preguntas? What if she asks questions?" Ethan lifted his wine glass with complete confidence. "No entiende español. Cree que solo tenemos con un inversionista. Después de firmar, toda la responsabilidad será de ella si algo sale mal." She doesn't understand Spanish. She thinks we're only having dinner with an investor. After she signs, all the responsibility will be hers, If anything goes wrong. They clinked their glasses. My heart pounded so hard I thought they might hear it across the table. Every instinct screamed at me to stand up, expose them, and walk away. Instead, I smiled. I even asked Alejandro whether he was enjoying Chicago. Neither man noticed anything unusual. While they relaxed, believing I was completely unaware, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't sitting beside my husband anymore. I was sitting beside the man who had quietly planned to sacrifice me to protect himself. Dinner continued as though nothing had happened. Alejandro recommended the sea base. Ethan joked about how impossible it was to find reliable contractors overseas. I smiled at the right moments, nodded politely, and even laughed once or twice. Inside, I was holding myself together one heartbeat at a time. If they realized I understood Spanish, everything would change. So, I decided they never would. Instead of confronting them, I became the most attentive listener at the table. The more confident they felt, the more careless they became. When Ethan excused himself to take a phone call, Alejandro stayed behind, scrolling through several digital contracts on his tablet. He muttered another sentence in Spanish about moving assets before the signatures made everything official. I memorized every word. A few minutes later, Alejandro stepped away to greet another guest, leaving a leather folder on the table. Without rushing, I reached for my phone as though checking a message. In less than 10 seconds, I quietly photographed every page visible inside the folder. Company names, property addresses, signature pages, a chart connecting several businesses I'd never heard Ethan mention before. By the time both men returned, my phone was back in my purse, and I was asking whether they recommended the dessert. Neither suspected a thing. On the drive home, Ethan seemed unusually cheerful. "I'll have some paperwork for you tomorrow," he said casually. "Nothing complicated. Just routine documents our attorney prepared. It'll help protect our future." Protect our future. Those 4 words echoed in my mind the entire drive. The next morning, he placed a thick stack of contracts on our kitchen island before leaving for the office. "Sign wherever the tabs are," he said with an easy smile. "No rush. I'll pick them up tonight." The moment his car disappeared down the street, I locked the front door and carried the documents into my office. Page by page, I read every line. The language was polished, professional, and deliberately confusing. But one section was unmistakably clear. If anything went wrong with the investment, every financial liability would fall entirely on me. My marriage hadn't just been built on lies. It had become the perfect legal trap. Section 4. Building a silent counter-move, 315 words. I didn't cry. I didn't throw the contracts across the room. And I definitely didn't call Ethan demanding answers. People who believe they've already won become careless. I had watched that happen at dinner the night before. If I wanted the truth, I needed them to keep believing I was exactly where they wanted me. So instead of reacting, I started planning. By 9 o'clock that morning, I was sitting inside the office of a corporate attorney named Rebecca Collins, carrying the contracts, the photographs from Alejandro's folder, and the audio recording I had quietly captured during dinner. Rebecca listened without interrupting. When Ethan's voice filled the room, confidently explaining that every legal responsibility would end up in my name, she paused the recording and slowly leaned back in her chair. "This is serious," she said calmly. "Don't sign a single page." For the next 2 hours, we examined every document line by line. The ownership structure was intentionally complicated. Several companies existed only on paper. Critical liabilities were hidden beneath layers of legal language that most people would never question. Rebecca explained that while some clauses weren't illegal by themselves, the combination of the contracts, recordings, and photographs painted a deeply troubling picture. We immediately preserved every file, created certified copies, and documented exactly when each piece of evidence had been collected. "If this reaches court," Rebecca said, "timing will matter." When I returned home that afternoon, Ethan was already there. He smiled the moment he saw me. "So," he asked casually, "did you finish signing everything?" I forced myself to smile back. "Not yet. I had clients all day." He looked disappointed for only a second before hiding it. "No problem," he replied. Just make sure it's done before Friday. Friday. That was the day investors would gather to finalize the partnership. The day Ethan expected me to unknowingly protect him forever. Instead, it would become the day everyone learned exactly who he really was. And he still had no idea Friday morning arrived with a strange calm that sometimes comes before everything changes. Ethan left the house whistling. He looked relaxed, confident, completely certain the biggest deal of his career was only a few signatures away. I dressed exactly the way he had suggested. A navy blazer, simple jewelry, and a professional smile. He even complimented me before we walked into the downtown conference center. "You look perfect," he said. I wondered if he'd still think that an hour later. The conference room overlooked the city skyline. Around the polished table sat investors, corporate attorneys, accountants, financial advisors, and Alejandro, who greeted me with the same effortless charm he'd shown at dinner. Coffee was poured. Presentations began. Charts filled a large screen as Ethan confidently explained projected profits, international expansion, and future developments. Everyone seemed impressed. Finally, the contracts were distributed. Ethan slid my copy toward me with a reassuring smile. "Once Sophia signs," he announced, "we'll officially complete the partnership." Every pair of eyes turned toward me. I picked up the pen, then quietly placed it back on the table. "I'd actually like to ask one small favor first," I said politely. The room fell silent. "It'll only take 2 minutes." Ethan frowned slightly. "What kind of favor?" I reached into my handbag, removed my phone, and connected it to the conference room speaker. "I think everyone here deserves to hear one conversation before any documents are signed." Before Ethan could react, the recording began. His own voice echoed through the room in flawless Spanish. "Tonight she's yours. Tomorrow she'll sign everything we need." Nobody spoke. The recording continued. "She doesn't understand Spanish. All the responsibility will belong to her." The silence became unbearable. Several investors slowly looked toward the translated subtitles appearing automatically on the presentation screen. Alejandro's confident smile disappeared first. Then Ethan's. One attorney reached forward and closed his folder, without saying a word. Another investor quietly removed his glasses. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, neither of them looked like the smartest men in the room. Understood every word he had ever tried to hide. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The only sound in the room was Ethan's recorded voice finishing the conversation he had never expected anyone else to understand. Then one of the lead investors slowly turned toward him. "Is that your voice?" Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. Alejandro recovered first. "It's being taken out of context," he said quickly. "We were joking." I calmly slid a neatly organized folder across the conference table. "I thought you might say that." Inside were printed photographs of the documents I had quietly copied during our dinner, alongside the contracts Ethan had later asked me to sign. Rebecca, my attorney, who had been sitting silently beside me until that moment, finally spoke. "We've already reviewed these materials. Several provisions deserve immediate legal examination before this transaction proceeds." The room changed instantly. Business smiles disappeared. Professional caution took over. An attorney representing one of the investment firms began comparing the contracts page by page. Another requested copies of every ownership record connected to the project. Within minutes, questions started coming from every direction. Why is the liability assigned solely to Mrs. Bennett? Why weren't these affiliated companies disclosed earlier? Who approved these revisions? Neither Ethan nor Alejandro had convincing answers. One investor quietly stood. "I'm suspending our participation until an independent audit is completed." Another closed his laptop. "Our board will require a full legal review before discussing this project again." One by one, others agreed. The momentum Ethan had spent months building collapsed in less than 15 minutes. He finally looked directly at me. "You understood Spanish?" His voice barely rose above a whisper. I met his eyes without anger. I understood every word. For the first time since we had married, he looked genuinely afraid. Not because I had embarrassed him, because he realized his own confidence had destroyed everything. The language he believed would hide his deception had become the evidence that exposed it. As investors quietly walked out of the conference room, nobody shook Ethan's hand. Nobody congratulated Alejandro. The meeting ended exactly the opposite of how they had planned. And for the first time in days, I finally felt like I could breathe again. The weeks that followed were surprisingly quiet. There were lawyers, paperwork, and endless meetings, but none of it felt as heavy as the silence that settled over my life after I finally stopped pretending everything was fine. The investment deal officially collapsed before any contracts were signed. Several investors withdrew immediately, choosing to protect their companies rather than gamble on people whose honesty had suddenly become impossible to trust. Rebecca handled every legal step of my separation from Ethan. Because I had refused to sign those documents and preserved every piece of evidence before confronting him, I walked away without carrying the financial burden he had planned for me. The apartment we once shared became just another address I no longer needed. I found a bright studio closer to downtown, filled it with natural light, fresh plants, and sketches for new design projects. For the first time in months, the space around me finally matched the peace I was beginning to feel inside. About 3 months later, Ethan asked if we could meet one last time. We sat in a quiet coffee shop only a few blocks from my new office. He looked exhausted, older somehow. After several awkward minutes, he finally asked the question I already knew was coming. "Why didn't you confront me that night at dinner?" I looked at him for a moment before answering. "Because you believed I couldn't understand you." He lowered his eyes. "I wanted you to keep talking," I continued calmly. "Sometimes the truth reveals itself only when people believe no one is listening." Neither of us spoke after that. There was nothing left to explain. As I walked back toward my office, I realized I wasn't carrying anger anymore. Only clarity. Looking back now, I understand that betrayal rarely begins with one terrible decision. It begins with small lies people convince themselves will never be discovered. Ethan thought language would hide the truth. Instead, it preserved it. The greatest victory wasn't exposing him. It was refusing to let his deception define the rest of my life. Sometimes the strongest response isn't revenge. It's quietly protecting yourself, walking away with your integrity, and building a future no one else can steal. And that was the day my heart finally started beating for me again.